Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today is my ECW colleague, Dwight Hughes. Dwight, how are you today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Awesome.
Beautiful spring day.
It's a gorgeous spring day. Although I guess since we're both inside doing a podcast, we can't really fully enjoy it. But we've gotten together today to talk about Dwight's brand new book, part of the Emerging Civil War series, Unlike Anything That Ever Floated. It's a book about the battle between the Monitor and the Virginia. Although I still remember it as a kid as the Monitor versus the Merrimack because that alliterative M. So congratulations on the new book, Dwight.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, what got you interested in writing about the Battle of Hampton Roads?
Oh, well, you did. Actually, well, I wanted to do another Navy Civil War history book, and I had become involved in the Emerging Civil War group and was blogging with it. So we talked about what Navy engagements we could write for the Emerging Civil War series, I made several suggestions, one of which was the Battle of Hampton Roads, and that was the one that we decided you wanted to do. I frankly was a little hesitant because so much has been written about this battle that I wasn't sure what new I could say, but I discovered that I had a fair amount new to say about it, and really enjoyed putting the book together.
And of course, with the Emerging Civil War series, yes, maybe there has been quite a bit written about this, but none of it's been written for us. And
that's right.
Since these books are really intended as gateway drugs, here's your first stop, something that'll give you an overview. And then if you want something more in depth, you can go on to some of those more detailed discussions. So, yeah. Dwight, what was it like to try to boil down such a well-known story into something that someone can sit down and read in just a couple hours?
Well, that was one of the real challenges, of course, both fun and a challenge. My first Civil War Navy history book was something over 100,000 words, and I had to boil down to what less than half of that. And so you have to really focus yourself both in time and subject matter. And so I had to draw pretty hard lines about the beginning and the ending, what I was going to talk about, and then focus the subject matter properly. And that gets your mind focused, and you have to work at doing that. You also have to make sure that every word counts, and that was both a fun and a challenge. And you should keep going back and back over the story, and writing history should not be inconsistent with telling a good story. So that's what you really try to do. And as part of that process, I tried to incorporate fiction writing elements and procedures into that, so that we could tell a good story.
And when you talk about elements of fiction, you're talking about a little bit of characterization and some intentional plotting, how you set a scene, some of those things that really make fiction pretty captivating. How did you decide to sort of work with those elements of fiction to imbue a little extra life in your nonfiction?
Well, one of the things that's really fun about Civil War writing is that there's so much dialogue already there for you. Of course, you don't have to invent the plot either, which is helpful, but you can work with the plot and work with the timelines and work with foreshadowing and backshadowing and backflashes and things like that. But the dialogue was fun because the first thing I do is I go back to the primary sources, and I didn't go into depth on many of the secondary sources, the books that have been written since, or the other books that have been written about the battle, because I didn't want to see it from another author's perspective. I wanted to see it from from the participant's perspective. So I'd go to the secondary sources and look at their bibliographies and look at their quotes, and then I'd go build the bibliography, and then I'd go back to the primary sources, and then you find the dialogue, you find the quotes, and a lot of them, and then you kind of weave them all together in the story, and then you work with them to incorporate both the participant's words and his perspective, and you do that by picking the juiciest quotes. Now, of course, they like to write in very elaborate Victorian prose and a lot more words than we need or we like to read these days. So you have to boil it down. So you pick the juicy quotes and you kind of start a paragraph with something that gets into the subject, and then you end the paragraph with something that kind of concludes what the guy's talking about, and in between you try to retain some of the phraseology and the wording and the spirit of what the person has said, but you have to really, it becomes a matter of editing, of smoothing it out and making good transitions, and you try to get the author backed out of the scene and get the participant right in front. And that I find is a real fun challenge.
And the craft that is involved with shaping a plot like that, so that you do have that sort of writer's art, is very intentional, but you also want it to be invisible. You don't want the writing to be forward stage. You want the speakers and the characters to be out there.
That's right. That's right.
So,
and that.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, that's what a good fiction story has to do. And of course, they have to start and invent their plot and characters and all that from the beginning. We have to discover them, and to do that, you have to really get into the original sources and try to pull out the people and their characters and their personalities, and then try to get that on the page.
So give us a synopsis of the plot of this story then, if you will. The Battle of Hampton Roads, March 8th and 9th of 1862. And just a stunning development in the war, because as the title says, it's unlike anything that had ever happened before. What goes on?
Well, of course, the centerpiece of the story is the engagement between the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, AKA Merrimack. But there's much more to it. And it actually was a 2-day battle. And I think the first day doesn't get as much attention as it should. When the CSS Virginia first came out and engaged the USS Congress and the USS Cumberland and sank both in a very dramatic battle. So rammed one and bombarded the other and into kindling and until it was just burning. And so I tried to balance that story so that first day's battle got the attention it deserved in the overall picture.
For that one day, the Confederate Navy is the most powerful Navy in the world.
That's right. In that one place, yes, that's true. And it was, and that first day was the biggest defeat the United States Navy suffered until Pearl Harbor. So it was a pretty traumatic event for the Union and the United States and for the U.S. Navy, as well as a pretty dramatic victory for the Confederacy, and it deserves to be told. But then I wanted to back up more farther from that and provide some background as to how these vessels developed. And one of my goals was to make the ships themselves, the Monitor and the Virginia, central characters in the story. And that's why I start off with 2 chapters that actually the first chapter is primarily to introduce the Monitor and to give the reader an understanding of what the ship was, how it was basically how it was put together, what it was like to be on the ship like that, why it was so revolutionary to the people who were there. And then the second chapter goes back is an introduction to the Virginia, and just basically how she was built, what she looked like, and what it felt like to be there. And then having done that, then back up and tell in more detail the origins of the two ships and how the Monitor was a dramatic illustration of the Industrial Revolution in the North primarily. But it was more than that. It was also illustrated some of the social and cultural and political developments that were going on, and what was the technological background and the technological history, and then do that again for the Virginia, and how it represented not a technological revolution, but really a pretty a dramatic instance of people doing a lot with a little, and very innovative, very dedicated men who got in there with very little to start with, and did something that was pretty dramatic. And of course, they built their Navy entirely on the U.S. Navy. So here you had just kind of two really almost identical in cultural terms navies fighting each other. So having done that, then you build the drama through the first day's battle and into the climax of the second day's battle, and then that's where it ends. I wanted to go farther because there's more to tell the story, but we did in the appendices tell the story, basically the story of how the two ships went on after the battle, after the big battle itself, and what happened to them.
Now, it's funny you talk about the ships as characters, and as I sit here and I think about that, so really then the Virginia is a galvanized Yankee, having once been a Federal ship that was repurposed by the Confederate Navy.
That's a way of putting it. I hadn't thought about it, but yes, that's an excellent thought. The the Virginia was basically an iron shed built on top of the hull of the former USS Merrimack. And interestingly, the Merrimack was one of the most powerful and most well-known ships in the U.S. Navy before she was captured with the Norfolk Navy Yard and burned and sunk to the waterline, and the Confederates raised her, and they managed to salvage the hull and the engines, and then they built this pretty sturdy iron shed on top of it, and that was it. I mean, it was not. It was elegant in its simplicity, actually, and was a model for most of the Confederate ironclads. Basically, they did the same thing. But you're right. It was a Yankee ship with a rebel iron shed on top of it.
So when you compare the appearance then of the Monitor, which sails in on the 9th, and this is a radically different design. I mean, really something totally new as opposed to the Virginia, which is sort of like this cobbled together piece. Like the Monitor represents this whole new technology all across the board. What did you discover about that as you were researching it and kind of pulling that story together?
Yeah, the Monitor was not so much new technology as it was a unique and innovative combination of technology that was developing, and people tend to think of the engagement as the first battle of the ironclads. Well, it was, but like it changed. It made all navies obsolete in one day and changed naval history forever. And in the public mind, it did, because the public wasn't aware of these developments, but the Navy community and engineering community had these were the culmination of trends that had been coming together for some time. The development of iron, the technology of creating iron and rolling iron plates and so on was developing, and it was still not the best. It was not all reliable, and it was not always the best, and it was not necessarily better than a wooden hull. Uh, but it was coming along, and the English and the French had actually were much farther ahead than the Americans. The Americans weren't interested in building ironclads because we had so many trees, and the English didn't have many trees, and they had a lot more coal. So they built ironclads. And actually, the primary strategic purpose for building an ironclad was to counter the developments in England and France, because they were developing ironclad fleets and had been the first to develop seagoing ironclad warships. And the Secretary of the Navy and the President and the Congress are very concerned about England intervening in the war and bringing across a fleet, including ironclad warships, and repeating the War of 1812, only worse. So their first priority was to develop an ironclad that could fend off the English if they came across. But they also wanted, of course, to develop something to counter the Confederate ironclads that were being built. But anyway, the inventor, John Ericsson, put together this design. He'd been thinking of this he'd thought of this years before. The profile of the monitor is so low in the water, it's only a couple feet the deck is only a couple feet above the water surface. And he modeled it after Swedish lumber rafts. He was a Swede, and he grew up there, and he used to seeing these rafts of logs on the rivers, and that's a lot of lumber. And so he put that idea together, a low profile ship, encased in iron, and then he put the turret on top of it. Now, the idea of an ironclad revolving turret was not new either. I mean, engineers have been working with this idea for some time, both for land-based and for shipboard use. And actually, there was an English inventor who was developing and testing a revolving turret in England. And his design was actually better than Ericsson's, and turned out to be one that was adapted in future developments more than Ericsson's was. There was an American inventor who had a patent for an ironclad rotating battery that could be used either ashore or afloat. And Ericsson actually paid royalties to him for this patent. So Ericsson didn't invent the turret, and he never claimed to have invented it, but he was the first man to actually put it together and deploy it. So he put together this low-profile, relatively small ship with the crew and officers pretty much below the waterline, with a low-profile steam engine in it, and then the armored turret with a couple powerful guns. And so that was a new combination of ideas. And sailors, of course, were not used to that, and it was a difficult, if not frightening, experience for them to.
And that design actually will lead to the monitor's eventual demise at the end of 1863.
62, yeah.
62, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Because it's that low to the water design makes it susceptible to swamping. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, the Monitor was not a seagoing vessel, so the Navy was actually very skeptical, and a lot of people were skeptical that the thing would even float. How could a little hunk of iron float? And so it was good for harbor and shallow water defensive purposes. But it was not a seagoing vessel, and it wasn't even good against fortifications because it only had 2 guns, and you couldn't elevate those very high. So it actually, as an overall design, was not very successful. And so when they did take it to sea, they had to tow it, because the engines were not powerful enough against really heavy seas and heavy winds. And when she was coming down from New York, as this first chapter of the book talks about, she almost sank because they got into a gale, and the water was flooding in through the smokestacks and through the air intake ports, and they putting out the boiler fires, and she almost sank. But she was at the end of a tow line by a big steam tug, so they towed her into calmer water. Well, at the end of 1862, they decided they were going to take her down south and join her up with another fleet of ships and do some try to go after Charleston or one of the other big Confederate ports down there. And they were towing her around Cape Hatteras, and they ran into another storm, and she did sink. So that's what happened to her.
Now, how is it that the Monitor shows up just in the nick of time after the Virginia basically savages the U.S. Navy in Hampton Roads? As you said, the worst day in U.S. naval history up until Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, the Monitor happens to show up at the right time. How does that happen?
Well, it was both luck and coincidence. In the summer in the spring and early summer of 1862 or 1861, Confederate Secretary of the Navy Mallory was really going to get into ironclads because Mallory was very good at his job. He was a Florida senator who had been chairman of the Committee on Naval Affairs in the Senate in the 1850s. And he had been a real innovator in Navy, and he wanted to modernize the Navy, and he was campaigning for ironclad development then. And he was actually the one that sponsored the development of the ships, the cruisers that became the Merrimack class of ships. So the Merrimack that became the Virginia, he was the guy that actually got that ship built too, along with her sister ships, like the Minnesota and the Roanoke. These were big traditional vessels with auxiliary steam engines, but they were the best of the wooden steam cruisers we had at the time, and even the Europeans recognized that they were very good ships. So anyway, he got into ironclad. He wanted to get in ironclads right away. And he wanted to build one from scratch, but they didn't have the time and they didn't have the resources to do that. So they had the hull of the USS Merrimack, which the Union forces had burned and sunk at the Norfolk Navy Yard before they abandoned it in the spring of 1862, or I'm sorry, in 1861, summer of 1861. So they raised that and used that, but it took them 6 months to convert her because they had to cut her down to the waterline again and rebuild the whole deck and rebuild the iron casemate on top. And in the meantime, there weren't any secrets in those days. The reporters were writing about all this going on, and people were going back and forth. So U.S. Secretary of the Navy Wells knew that all this was happening. And he knew he had to get something built to counter the Merrimack or the Virginia, because if she got loose into Hampton Roads, she could sink every wooden Navy ship there. So they contracted. They requested proposals for ironclad ships, and a whole bunch of proposals were sent in. Some were really crazy, like somebody wanted to build a rubber clad. Like that would work. But they chose 3 designs, and they built 2 traditional looking sailing vessels with iron plating and steam engines and propellers. And then they agreed to try Ericsson's design for the Monitor, and he got her started. And Ericsson was not only innovative in the way he designed it, but he got a conglomerate together of about 9 primary contractors and a whole bunch of subcontractors throughout New England. And these were all, ironworks manufacturers, locomotive manufacturers, various other industries in New England. And he organized this and had them all building these components and raw materials simultaneously to be assembled at Greenworks, Ironworks in Brooklyn. And it was really the first instance of a major civilian contracting effort where you're building a warship from scratch uh, with contractors and numerous subcontractors. So it kind of invented the whole business of civilian contracting. Um, Traditionally, ships were built in Navy shipyards or sometimes in a civilian shipyard contracted to the Navy. But of course, the Navy shipyards couldn't build ironclads. So most of this effort was in industrial facilities that were focused on like building locomotives and other types of steam engines for other purposes. And it was that's another part of the story that's not often told, but it was an industrial revolution as well as a technological one.
So they knew that they had to come up with something to counter the creation of the Virginia. They start towing it south. It still strikes me as this amazing coincidence that it happens to get there right when.
Yeah. Well, they got it. They got it launched a few days earlier. They did some very perfunctory testing of it, which there's some funny stories associated with. But they were in a big hurry to get her down south because they knew on the one side, the Union guys knew that the Virginia would probably come out of dry dock or be ready to go at any time. And if the Virginia ended up in Hampton Roads, they were in real trouble, which is what did happen. On the other hand, the Virginia was rushed because they knew that the Monitor was being built and was undergoing testing, and they knew she was going to show up any time. So both sides were very rushed, and Flag Officer Buchanan took the Virginia out, before a lot of people thought she was really ready to go, because he was going to get her into Hampton Roads and do some damage before the Monitor showed up. And then the Union folks wanted to get Monitor down there before the Virginia showed up, and so she ended up getting underway on the 6th, March 6th, and ended up coming into Chesapeake Bay the morning of March 8th. At the same time, the Virginia was coming out and engaging the Cumberland and the Congress. So while Virginia was sinking the Cumberland and the Congress, Monitor was coming through Chesapeake Bay and approaching Hampton Roads. It didn't get there till the evening. And actually, as the Monitor approached Hampton Roads, and dusk was falling. They saw the flashes of the guns and the shells bursting in air and all this happening. And a pilot came on board and told the Monitor that the Virginia that the Cumberland was sunk and the Congress was on fire, and so they wanted to get there as quick as they could, and they ended up getting there in the middle of the night. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, the Uss Minnesota, which went after the Virginia, ran aground in the middle of Hampton Roads because she was another deep water ship with a hull very similar to Virginia's, and they knew that Virginia was going to come back in the morning and finish destroying her if they didn't get there. So they got there in time, but just barely.
So, and I wonder what it's like to be there in the moment. You've got the Virginia just wreaking havoc on the fleet, and then the infamous shingle with a cheese box on it shows up. Does it strike terror in the hearts of anybody?
No, well, not initially. No. The Monitor steamed up to the Minnesota in the middle of the night, about midnight, about 11, 12 o'clock that night, and anchored. And the crewmen of the Minnesota, and even the folks on the Monitor were not really sure what's going to happen. You have to understand that they'd never been out in this ship before. They'd never really run her. They'd never tested her in combat conditions, or in much of any conditions. And so it was not clear to them what was going to happen. And they didn't know that Virginia had 10 guns and Monterey only had 2. You know, everybody said, well, how can a little iron raft with 2 guns defeat essentially an armored frigate with 10 guns? And then as dawn came up and the Minnesota was still stuck hard aground, and the captain of the Minnesota talked to the captain of the Monitor, Captain Warden, and Captain Warden told the captain of the Minnesota, he says, I'm going to help you all I can. I'm going to go get out there and defend you. And the captain of the Minnesota said, well, no, you can't really help me. I'm going to get ready to destroy my ship. And he actually was ready they had been most of the day and the night throwing stuff overboard, including some of their guns, and trying to lighten ship to get her off the shoal, which they didn't succeed in doing until way the next couple days later. And he was actually prepared to burn his ship rather than see the Virginia, the Confederates capture her.
It's kind of incredible. And then, like, yes, the Monitor does successfully mount a pretty big defense. Now, the battle itself is a draw. They shoot cannonballs at each other all day long, and things bounce off. And ultimately, though, the Monitor will, I guess, I would say the Monitor's successful because it survives, but the Confederates ultimately have to scuttle their ship. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, of course, people still argue about who won the Battle of Hampton Roads, and it depends on how you define winning. Tactically, the Monitor won because she stopped the Virginia from destroying any more Union ships.
Okay.
And but the Virginia also had achieved some major objectives. She had destroyed 2 major Union warships plus a few smaller ones, and there's good reason to believe that she probably didn't encourage George McClellan on the peninsula either, because, and of course, it doesn't take much to deter George McClellan. But one of the interesting questions I wanted to look into was what did George really think about the Monitor? I didn't find much on that, but we can assume that along with everything else that was going on, he had counted upon having naval support on the south side of the peninsula and up the James River. Both transporting his troops and supplying them and protecting his flank with heavy naval artillery, and he didn't get that. So it would have undoubtedly have affected his thinking. And the Virginia actually dominated the Hampton Roads for a few weeks after the battle. The Virginia came out several more times and tried to re-engage the Monitor, but the Navy Department said, no, don't take her on again, because the Monitor hadn't been seriously damaged, but she had taken some hits, and particularly on the pilot house. And they didn't want to take any chances of the Monitor being damaged and put out of action, because if that happened, then the rest of the fleet would be in trouble. Yeah. So they kind of danced around each other for a few weeks until the Union forces retook Norfolk, and then the Confederates had to destroy the Virginia because she couldn't go anyplace at that point. But Virginia achieved some important objectives for them, but Monitor stopped her from doing worse damage. Is what it amounts to.
I want to go back to the idea you mentioned earlier about trying to turn the ships into characters, because that's something you did in your first book, which was a biography of the Shenandoah. In fact, you call it a Confederate biography. And maybe one thing that non-Navy people don't understand is that each ship does have its own character.
For sure.
Tell us a little bit about that concept.
Yeah, well, what got me going on that was a quote from Raphael Semmes, the captain of the infamous CSS Alabama. And when he wrote his wonderful Memoirs of Service Afloat, which is one of the premier diaries of the war, and reminiscences of the war, and really should should be more widely read. But anyway, he introduced his memoirs with the phrase, "The cruise of a ship is a biography. A ship becomes a personification." And that's what got me thinking along that line. And of course, to sailors, ships are personifications. Seamen like to anthropomorphize their vessels, and the sea is a lonely profession, a very remote and esoteric profession. And of course, up until very recent history, it was an all-male profession. So ships become female, and they're encased in a ship, which is their protection, and they're dependent on it. And so the ship really is a character to a seaman. So I wanted to carry this forward into this story, because more so than, well, I think more so than the land campaigns, technology plays such an important part. And of course, a ship is a big machine. And so you are living in, and you are a cog in a huge machine. And that's a mindset that's different from what most people, especially at that time, appreciated and understood. They were beginning, the Industrial Revolution was really hitting its stride at that point. So they were starting to understand where technology was going, but it still had a long way to go.
Now, one of the things that I always find is really important when I'm working on a book is to go walk the battlefield. Kind of a challenge when you're talking about a big body of water.
That's right. That's right.
How do you wrap your head around that? How do you approach that sort of research?
Yeah, well, with my first book, of course, which takes place mostly at sea, it wasn't hard to envision for me because I'd had a career at sea. So once you've been to sea, you've been to sea. And so the challenge there was helping people who haven't been to sea to understand that and to be able to envision that. And you do that through the primary characters. And those folks, I had, 5 officer memoirs or journals, actually day-by-day journals and diaries and memoirs, and wonderful descriptions of actually being at sea. Well, it wasn't quite the same with this story, with the Monitor and the Virginia, because they weren't at sea. They were in a Roads, but they were still on the water. So that's important. But you had to set the context of what was around them, and so you bring in the context, the perimeters, the shorelines, the forts, and the other ships, the other vessels. And so I really worked to bring that in, because there were thousands of people who lined the shore on both sides, on both the north and the south shores of Hampton Roads, that watched all this. And there's some wonderful descriptions of that, just some magnificent descriptions of that. One Confederate general was on the South Shore watching the Cumberland sink and the Congress burn, and then the next day he watched the battle. And there was a young Union telegrapher who was at the fort, and he was standing on the ramparts, watching the Monitor come in the dusk, come in from the Chesapeake Bay in the dusk on one side, and he's standing on the high ramparts with the big guns, and watched the Monitor come in. And if he turned around on his other side, he could look out and see the Congress burning like a giant torch stuck in the mud. I mean, those aren't his words, and these people provide some very good descriptions of that. So I tried to work that into the book also, along of course with the observations of the guys who were actually on the vessels. And you have one Confederate lieutenant who's looking out through a gun port, and that's all he can see was just a few feet wide and a couple of feet high, and watching the water go by, and then suddenly the Congress appears in this little window that he's looking at. He's encased in 4 inches of iron and 2 feet of oak and pine armor, with this little window, and suddenly the Congress appears in this little window, and the Congress is a big, impressive ship. I mean, she was a big frigate. I mean, to most people, she'd look a lot like old Ironsides. I mean, the frigate designs, the warship designs had not changed really that much. And all of a sudden, her side erupts in gunfire as they fire it. And so those kinds of observations, as kind of viewpoints, to try to work into the story to give people a picture of what happened.
You have some great maps in the book too that you and Edward Alexander worked on. And
yes.
There's actually a tour section of the book, and I have to admit, I'm like, Dwight, we need a tour section. And in the back of my head, I'm thinking like rowboat out to middle.
That's right.
But there are actually things that you can still see that are associated with the battle.
Yes. Well, around the perimeter of Hampton Roads, we did a tour section in the back, and there are the wonderful Hampton Roads Museum where the Monitor Center is. I can't recommend highly enough what a wonderful place that is. They've got full-scale mock-ups of parts of both ships, and mock-ups of the interiors, and along with the actual pieces of the Monitor that were brought up. You can see the turret upside down in a preservation tank, and then you turn around and they've got 2 full-scale mock-ups of the turret, one with it right side up as it was during the actual action, and the other one with it upside down as they recovered it from the ocean bottom with the big guns laying now on the ceiling, and there were actually some remains. Well, they didn't show that, but there were some remains of the sailors inside when they brought it back up. So anyway, that's one of the first places, and then we trace around the coastline of the Virginia. And there's several lookouts where you can at least look across the water, and you can see the big vessels coming in and out of Hampton Roads, and you can see the misnamed Monitor Merrimack Bridge Tunnel. Not only do they use the wrong name for the instead of the Virginia, it's the Merrimack, but they use the misspelling of the Merrimack without the final K. But anyway, and then there's the Fortress Museum there, and then there's the Shipyard Museum where the Virginia was built, and Nauticus, and they got the Wisconsin battleship there, and so there's lots of good stuff you can see that relates to the story.
So I've got to ask you, you've been working on Navy stuff. It's been a huge way that you've enhanced the Emerging Civil War series now. You're our Navy guy on the block. What's next for Commodore Dwight Hughes?
well,
you're like our rear admiral. What's
next? Right. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I've been promoted. That's great.
By several ranks too.
That's right. I was Lieutenant Commander Hughes. Now I'm Admiral Hughes. That's great. Well, my next project is on the Mississippi River. I've done the ocean. I'm with the Shenandoah book, which is great. I've done a sort of a coastal story with the Monitor and the Virginia, and now I want to go into the heartland and do the rivers, and wonderful stories about the Mississippi River Squadron and how they conquered the Mississippi, starting with Forts Henry and Donelson, working down through Island Number 10, and then most dramatically, of course, Vicksburg. But I want to tell that from the water. Again, a sailor's perspective, is from the water, looking at the land when he can see the land, and that's a different perspective than being a soldier looking from the land out on the water. And of course, a lot has been written about these battles too, um, but from the land perspective. So this is going to look from the water. And I want to again work in the vessels as the vessels as characters, with the technological history that's so fascinating. The river ironclads, the poop turtles, they called them, were fascinating vessels, and how the Navy contributed to the taking not only of the river but of Vicksburg, and then controlling the river throughout the rest of the war. So that's a really fun project.
And a much different style of aquatic warfare than the ocean or the coast. So, just
Yes,
the topography challenges and the nature of the water itself is all different too. So.
That's right. That's right. It's wet, but it's different. Being a river sailor, and being a river sailor was a new thing. I mean, these were ocean sailors, and they didn't like to go into shallow water and narrow, confined waters that had fast currents and huge trees flowing down the river at them and so on. That was a new thing to them, and of course the business of steam river navigation, it had only been around for half a century maybe, and it was really burgeoning. And with the commerce, the Mississippi was the main artery of commerce throughout the whole continent. But neither the Army nor the Navy knew much about that, and they had to learn. Not only did they have to learn how to fight a war on these major inland waterways, but they had to learn how to fight together, Army and Navy combined operations, and that was a whole new thing too.
A whole new thing, yeah. So, well, the latest book, Unlike Anything That Ever Floated, The Battle of Hampton Roads, and I'm going to put in a pitch for a Confederate biography, the CSS Shenandoah, which is also a fantastic book. Dwight Hughes, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. I'm Chris Mikowski. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield, and in Dwight's case, on the water.